Zeynep Coşkun, Research Fellow at Al-Sharq Forum. Today we're in London for a conference co-organized with Chatham House and International Crisis Group on Europe and its neighborhood, conflict prevention and crisis management in the 21st century. Today I have with me a very distinguished guest who was also a panelist at our first session, Elizabeth Collett, who is the Director of Migration Policy Institute Europe. Hi Elizabeth,
Hello.
Thanks for joining us today.
No problem.
You had a great speech during the panel. We all feel enlightened, and it's a great honor to have you here.
Thank you.
So today we want to talk to you about your two of your work. One of them is your latest book, All at Sea, and your previous article, Into the Mainstream. So we have two questions for you. I think I want to start with All at Sea and the EU-Turkey deal, changing routes, whether actually that's a reality, and what's happening now with the increase, because 2016, now the numbers have already surpassed numbers, the death toll already surpassed 2015. So what's going differently now in maritime migration?
So it's important to distinguish between the Central Mediterranean route and the Eastern Mediterranean route. The Central Mediterranean route has remained surprisingly unchanged over the last couple of years, with the exception of, as you noted, an increase in the deaths of those people crossing, which is a terrible tragedy. What we've seen in the Central Mediterranean route is a mixed flow of those who are fleeing conflict and those who are coming perhaps for economic reasons or to join family members, coming largely from sub-Saharan Africa. And that mixed flow a couple of years ago was also joined by a number of people who were fleeing conflict in Syria, Iraq, and to some extent Afghanistan. Because of the instability in Libya, because it's harder to reach Libya, that flow is no longer part of the Central Mediterranean. And the reason it has become more dangerous is in part, it's thought, due to the fact that many smugglers are choosing to send individuals on more dangerous journeys in more precarious boats, because they're aware that there is a search and rescue facility in the Mediterranean that is run by European governments called Operation Sophia, which will then pick those individuals up closer to the coastline. So smugglers are sort of taking advantage in certain instances of that search and rescue. That whole dynamic is completely separate from the EU-Turkey deal, which was put in place to deal specifically with the Eastern Mediterranean route and people moving from the western coast of Turkey and a short hop to the Aegean Islands. That route was much less dangerous, partly because it was a shorter journey. And so there was a concern that if the EU-Turkey deal came into play, people who wanted to reach Europe would redirect themselves again back towards this more dangerous Central Mediterranean route. That so far hasn't happened. What we've seen is a drop in the numbers from thousands per day to hundreds per day. But that doesn't mean the route is entirely closed from Turkey to Greece and up through the Western Balkans. You do see individuals still willing to take that journey and willing to pay more in order to reach Berlin or to reach Stockholm or their intended destination. So the flow hasn't necessarily stopped, but I think for many policymakers it's dropped to a level which is tolerable in terms of their policy.
Talking about your other article, Into the Mainstream, where you advocate that governments should not be dealing with the refugee crisis as a department level, but this should be like a whole government level approach. Where does EU stand in endorsing such mechanisms? And also, where does Balkans stand, which are already tense and already they have their own conflicts, and now the added refugees. So it's a whole different dynamic that's going there. What EU can you do for those countries to employ such mechanisms?
So that paper focused on immigrant integration, which is what to do with people once they've arrived in a particular country, how to support their integration into a society, how to get their kids into school, how to get them into the labour market, how to facilitate communities that are mutually supportive. So the idea behind it is you cannot just think about integration policies in a narrow sense, but we've reached a moment, particularly over the last year in many countries, reached a moment where mainstream institutions, mainstream public services within Europe need to be adapted to be able to cope with a diverse community with diverse needs. So it's not just looking at immigrants, not immigrants, but looking at people in terms of having a range of characteristics. There will be some immigrants who come to Europe who won't have many integration needs, and there will be some nationals within particular countries without immigrant backgrounds who may have particular needs in terms of needing social support or literacy support or help getting into the labour market. So we should rearrange the way we think about integration, not to think about inserting a new population into our established communities, but thinking about how to manage that community as a whole, and using public services to do that, which then has to incorporate the needs of immigrants within a kind of broader perspective. So it's broadening out. That has been quite strongly, I think, endorsed at the EU level. You now see Directorates Generals, which is the departments at the EU level, really trying to engage with this issue for the first time and thinking about it in terms of social inclusion. There has been a change over the last couple of years. And in terms of the refugee crisis, if we step away from immigrant integration, we talk about the refugee crisis of the last year, you have seen increasingly a whole of government approach being taken. Ministries are involved for good, for less good. A lot of different ministries are now involved in the refugee crisis. I'm not quite sure how that links to the Balkan question, but what I can say is that for Balkan countries, while mobility is not a new phenomenon, there's an enormous amount of mobility in the Balkans region historically as well. The idea of conforming to the EU acquis, the EU policies, as part of an accession process, means that there are a number of countries trying to recreate asylum systems and recreate integration policies according to how Western European countries do that in a context where they're experiencing a great deal of pressure in terms of transit migration and new arrivals. And I think there is a need to really support those countries in developing robust institutions for governance, as well as the institutions that can deal with migration. And again, yes, take a whole of government approach, but they're at a much earlier point in that development in terms of developing their thinking on immigration systems.
The reason I brought it up was that one of the arguments is that Europe would rather keep those refugees in Balkans and use the Balkans as a buffer zone, basically, so that refugees do not approach.
That's not actually
bilateral agreements with the Balkan countries.
Yeah, that's not really happened. What you see is the EU-Turkey deal being that sort of buffer whereby people would be sent back to Turkey and Turkey will look after large refugee populations, with plan B being if that fails then we'll ask Greece to do that. There has really been no serious consideration of the idea that Western Balkan states would take that on, because I think there's an understanding within Europe that that's not a possibility. However, there is, I think, a lot of focus on mobility of Western Balkans nationals themselves who have arrived in Berlin. If you look at the number of asylum seekers over the last couple of years in Germany, significant proportion were coming from places like Kosovo and other Western Balkan states who weren't actually in need of protection but are actually coming for economic purposes. So there has been a focus on trying to accelerate the return of those nationals back to the region and break that dynamic of coming and then claiming asylum, because it creates delays in the asylum system for those who might be in need of protection. So there isn't, it's not necessarily thinking of the Western Balkans as a buffer zone, but it is thinking of the Western Balkans as a sending country, and now over the last year thinking of it as a transit country. How can we support these countries to manage migration flows better? But while geographically it may look like a buffer zone, I think the real focus is on Greece, Turkey and further afield.
And is there a system to support these countries?
There is. I mean, there is enormous amounts of funding coming from the European Union to help build institutions. There are twinning programs. There are countries, particularly in Central Europe, talking to them, saying, what do you need? How can we help? These are long-term processes. The accession process is in part meant to inspire countries to meet the standards created by the European Union on things like asylum and refugee protection. However, what we've seen over the last couple of years is that many EU member states themselves don't meet those standards for protection. So it's harder and harder to ask Western Balkans countries to meet standards that countries in Central Europe might not themselves be meeting. So perhaps some of the inspirational part of that is gone, but there is certainly functional support.
One of the things during the session that you underlined was that this is going to be a long time process, and you talked about a decade, but that the political spheres do not tolerate that kind of long-term decision making.
So yes, I mean, depending on what part of this policy, and we're talking about the foreign policy of migration and creating partnerships with particular countries, there's a great deal of rhetorical chat about addressing root causes, the root causes of migration that impel people to move. Well, that is conflict resolution, conflict prevention, that is poverty reduction strategies, creating alternative employment opportunities in regions of origin and even regions of transit. We're talking about an endeavour that is generational. These things, you know, it's not as if development policy hasn't been trying to do many of these things, or humanitarian policy hasn't been trying to do many of these things. It takes a long time to get these things done. Juxtaposed against that is the more immediate concern from EU member states of how to manage migration flows themselves, how to ask countries to manage their own borders to prevent departures or transit movements, how to invest in third countries' own countering of smuggling activities, and also to encourage countries to accept the returns of their own nationals, as we saw with the recent agreement between the EU and Afghanistan. This is a huge priority for the EU. These are much more short-term transactional endeavours. We will pay you money if you invest in these sorts of things. They are not the generational activities, and those are the things the EU are really wanting to invest in. However, for those partner countries, their interest is in the long term, is in long-term growth, and not necessarily in these short-term issues. So there's a mismatch in expectations about how these partnerships might go forward. And finally, I think, you know, the willingness to invest deeply in these countries also depends on the political will within the European Union. And as we're seeing, the political will and the sense of crisis is I think, now resurging, and with a number of difficult political elections next year, not least France, the Netherlands, and also Germany. The ability of governments to think long term about some of these issues might be quite restricted. So,
to finish up with, now that you brought up the elections that are coming up and the Brexit and everything, do you think that the Turkey-EU deal is in danger with all this changing dynamics?
I mean, I think it's been an inherently fragile deal from the outset. It has always been, to some extent, at the whim of the Turkish president to cut off the deal at any moment he wants to, and he's frequently threatened to do so and uses it as a rhetorical tool. My concern is that the Turkey deal is heavily dependent on the EU turning a blind eye to many activities in Turkey, but also delivering on visa liberalisation within Turkey, between the Turkey and the European Union, which I think becomes less and less likely as time goes on. If that deal ends, I don't think we'll see a resumption of the flows to the scale that we saw in the second half of 2015 coming from Turkey to Greece, but you will see an increase, and it will have a destabilising effect. So there is a strong link, I think, between the sense of management that the EU could create and avoidance of crisis and how publics will respond in the upcoming elections. It's going to be an extremely difficult year, I think.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.